Well, with well over a foot of snow on the ground, as far as the eye can see, and there's not a whole lot going on in the garden. And even the compost bins have a good old cap of snow on there. They're frozen for the season and they'll warm up in the spring. So hopefully those will be ready for spreading out on the garden. But in the meantime, I decided to clean out my chicken coop and throw it out here on the fruit orchard. I mean, there's no sense storing it up in the house or trying to compost it. It may not be good for annual plants, as it might burn the roots, so they say, but for perennial plants, I can't see that being any sort of problem. So took a couple buckets, brought it out here. Excuse the wind, I know it's going to be blowy, but there's nothing to break it right now. So yeah, I brought the buckets out here, spread some stuff around. That's going to melt into the snow. That's going to get covered with more snow. That's going to produce compost tea, composted chicken manure tea. And that should really give these perennial plants, these berry bushes and trees, a jump start in the spring. As I said, I only had 2 5-gallon buckets, so I did what I could. Maybe a third, and I'm going to make more, so I'll finish spreading out more compost when I get it. And hopefully this fruit orchard will just bust out with green leafy stuff and a ton of fruit next year. Well, that's all I'm doing. And it's chilly. I'm going to go back inside now. Have a great day. Composting is an ongoing process. So, over the last fall and overwintering, I had this bay here was filled, and that bay over there was filled. And over the winter, I should say the fall and early spring, they decomposed to 2/3 their size. I think one was like half its size. And so what I do is I only turn my compost once. So from the outside bins, I turn them into the center bin here, and I just did this. And we're just going to let this sit here and decompose and finish composting. Now, I like this little 3-bay system because I can take a full compost pile here and a second full compost pile there and just turn them into one central bin. And then from the central bin, it goes right out into my garden, which is just across the way. I have another 2-bay system right here. It's right across from the main path that leads down, separating the orchard from the annual garden. So I think this is a great place to have another compost bin here. So I got a little 2-bay system here where I fill up one and then I turn it into the other. But last fall I got a little lazy, didn't get it turned, and just filled up both compost bins, absolutely full. I run out of compost bin space so fast with all the composting I do. So one was finished last fall, and it had sat there all, well, it was finished last summer, so I sat there all fall, then all winter, and then all spring. So I finally emptied it, and that was this one right there. And then I finished this one in the fall. That one overwintered, and I turned it into this one. So now I'm going to let this one rest. And that one decomposed. It was a full bin, and it dropped down to 2/3. So turned it into this one, fluffed it up a bit, and it's heating up again. It'll continue breaking down for a little while. And we'll let that go. So now these bins are about 4 feet on a side, so it's 4-foot cubes. And so I'll be left with about 32 cubic feet of compost. And so what does that work out to? So I put out 32 feet of compost out of this bin, and I had to empty out a bin from my 3-bay / 5-bay composting system over there, and that was another 32 cubic feet. And I put 64 cubic feet of compost out on this garden so far, which it used all of it. That's a lot of compost. But it is the fuel for the garden, and that's how I get the growth out of this garden that I do. And still got composting operations going on. So this is a bin that was freshly turned about 2-3 weeks ago, and it's continuing to break down. It's still steaming, so we'll let that break down a little bit more. That's probably what I'm going to use to fill some of the beds to grow potatoes in. And we got a pile of fresh stuff. Hey, I keep my composting simple. Set of pallets, either screwed or wired together. Some slab boards on the front that I screw in as I build the beds up. And inside there, I basically throw in coffee grounds, shredded leaves, grass clippings, kitchen scraps, chicken bedding. Everything goes in there in layers. I try to mix up the layers a little bit so that you get some nitrogen, some carbon. I surround everything with a wall of cardboard boxes, and that tends to keep things moist, but not soggy, and it seems to work pretty well. So, yeah, composting still going on. Also have some charcoal I throw in there from the fire pit, and so I'm making biochar, and that'll all go out in the garden probably in the fall. At least this bin will. Hello there everybody. This video is about composting and the chunky compost that I use. And yes, this is the stuff I actually throw out on the garden beds. Now if it's like this, usually I like to throw this out in the fall, but if I have it in the springtime, I've got special uses for it. So I do throw it out here. And this was all in the fall here. So as you can see, I threw that chunky stuff out in the fall, and it is actually broken down into a very fine compost sitting on top of the soil here. And you know what? I don't see anything wrong with this stuff. Some of the chunkier undecomposed carbon material, yeah, I did scrape some of that up, but most of it just broke down. And the undecomposed stuff I'm just throwing into the next compost bin. So over here is the same thing. I put this out in the fall before, and it was all hard, chunky stuff. And what I did is I simply ran a stirrup hoe through it to kill off any of the weeds that had not been broken down yet, and ran a leaf rake over it, scooped up all the chunky, undecomposed carbon material. That'll go back into a compost bin. And what you are left with is a fine mix of compost sitting right on the surface here. Perfectly good. But I've done it for this bed. I've done it for this bed. Still got to rake that up and throw it back in the compost bin. So when I have that big, hard, chunky stuff in the springtime and I want to use it, this year I'm going to take this stuff and throw it in my improvised Ruth Stout-ish potato bed. And so what I did is, this is a pathway that I have started to cover and smother. There's grass over there. And I want to turn this section into a potato bed and get some use out of it while the weeds and grass underneath are decomposing. So what I did is I put the cardboard down, I put some leaves down, I bordered it with some logs that I had lying around the property because I've got lots of them, and then I took some of this used siding for the insides. I'm going to take this chunky compost, 2 wheelbarrow loads, throw it on top of the leaf litter, then I'm going to plant my potatoes in it, and then I'm going to cover it with more leaves and pine needles. And I'm pretty much expecting a decent crop out of that. So that's a way of using your chunky compost in the springtime. That's how I do it. And whatever's left over when I go to pull the potatoes out, that's just going to be spread out over on the fruit orchard, and they can get their use out of it. I also like this, especially out on perennial beds, for not only for the fruit orchard, but just anywhere in general where I have like strawberries and asparagus. So over here I've got a strawberry and asparagus bed. They're flowering. They could definitely use a dressing of compost. So so what I'm going to do is scatter that compost on top, and it's going to be first of all very fertile, and the strawberries will get their use out of it. The asparagus can get their use out of it, but also the worms will get their use out of it, because the undecomposed material that's still moldy and fungally dominant, fungally infused, is going to be food for the worms. And so I am actively maintaining a healthy worm population in my gigantic worm bed. So that's it for using chunky compost in a garden. That's how I use it, and I'm going to get back to work now, finish dumping this wheelbarrow and raking it out in here, and then I can plant my potatoes, grab some bags of shredded leaves, dump it on top, and I'm done.